Ord. Okay, perfect. Awesome. All right. So today I have Jonathan Ord on the podcast with me today. He is someone I've actually talked about on previous episodes. I've talked about that CEO. This is the guy. Um, he's had such a huge influence on my life, not just from a professional standpoint, but in so many other ways. And the reason I've wanted to have him on this podcast is because when I unpack leadership, I can't think of a better person who has done it so well and who wasn't afraid of going against the norms. And I've always been in awe of how he did it. He did basically everything that Simon Sinek and all these guys talk about in the books without necessarily following the books. It was something that came very naturally to him, and a lot of us, are trying to read and be like that. So for me, first of all, welcome, Jonathan. Thank you.
I appreciate it. I think all your podcast listeners need to know that I paid you for a long period of time and didn't fire you. So you're probably paying nice things about me because I gave you a job, which is, that's great.
I
No, I
love it.
appreciate it. Those are very nice things. You're too nice to me.
So Dealer Socket was the company that Jonathan founded, and I'll have him talk a little bit about just that story because it's an incredible story. And for me, one of the things I've always said is kind of like your childhood upbringing and how that can impact the rest of your life and who you are and can create bad habits or good habits. I think in the same way, your professional upbringing um, has the same influence, the people you're around and the things you learn, and that can carry on for the rest of your career. So I consider myself so lucky to have had a phenomenal professional upbringing at Dealer Socket, thanks to you and a lot of the other people at the company. Um, and I want people to kind of understand your leadership philosophy because it was a company that was built on love. So Jonathan, phenomenal. I think it was over 20 years, starting from a garage, from your partner Brad Perry's garage, to amazing things. I mean, I'm sure. What's your 2-minute kind of story of Dealer Socket?
Well, yeah, thanks for the nice words. You just basically completed everything that we ever wanted out of Dealer Socket by what you just said, which is creating an environment where people can progress through meaningful relationships. And so I'm humbled that you said that, and I too was a recipient of that growth and of that incubation inside of Dealer Socket. And I think the way we all interacted together was a huge benefit to me and my family and my learning process. So I really appreciate that, and I know that as you know, I've invested in a couple different people that used to work with us and still involved in their businesses and take calls all the time from people that that need advice, and I call people from time to time when I need advice. And so there's a great kind of fraternity of resources that we have in these relationships that we have, and we've always thought that was the real reason behind Dealer Socket, and that Dealer Socket as an entity would kind of go away at some point or change hands, ownership wise, but that the relationships were the key value proposition. And so I appreciate that. No, yeah, Dealer Socket was a fun story. You know the story really, really well. I come from an entrepreneurial family. My dad was a home builder. I spent a bunch of time working on job sites when I was little, stacking lumber and sweeping slabs and throwing rocks off of roads before they get graded, just because my dad wanted me to go out and do busy work. And so I loved creating things and watching things be built. And we just happened to fall into building things with technology instead of with 2x4s and 2x6s. And so and Brad, right? Brad is the best partner I could have ever had in the business. Number one, because he's one of the most humble guys I've ever met, and he's not needy. As you know, there's a time when after a bunch of years in the business where we both started to make a little bit of money, and Brad was living in a 2-bedroom, two bath house in Ladera, and and he had 4 kids, and I said, I commented to him, I said, Brad, you gotta upgrade your house. Like, it's time. Your wife deserves it. And he said, Jonathan, you got to understand something. He said, I grew up with a carport. I've got a 2-car garage. I'm living the life. And
I
so,
love it.
so that's, I mean, that just in a nutshell is Brad Perry. And so I love him to death. He's like a brother to me, and it couldn't have chosen a better partner that completed a lot of things that I wasn't good at, and that he was. And so, but the way we kind of came up with the idea is I helped start a company, and came in with 2 other partners with basically a technology consulting company that we partnered with Onyx Software, and resold Onyx Software and did CRM stuff for whoever would pay us money. And we learned a lot about that model. That was in the late 90s. And we started to be an application service provider for those companies, meaning that we would host all of their infrastructure and then enable Onyx Software and eventually Great Plains and Epicor Software in a hosted environment. And we thought, man, we can get our customers to be more successful. We can keep their technology upgraded with their ever-changing business needs. There's just a lot of things we could do differently with this ASP model. And so we enjoyed that quite a bit. And then we had the opportunity. There's a whole nother story behind the disposition of that company, but we basically went through a transaction on that company, and I came out of it and said, man, I'd love to take what I've learned about customer relationship management in these vertical markets and what we've started to understand about hosting software for customers and build an application or a group of applications for some niche vertical industries. And so we went about that, and we actually learned a lot in the previous business that goes to some of your earlier statements, which is, in the downturn, right? We had a big run up in the business, and we grew it to a couple hundred employees, and then I had to fire 40 people in the space of about 10 days. And it was because we had leveraged some of the company. We'd put some debt on the company thinking it was just going to be an endless growth spurt. And it turned. And we said to ourselves, Brad and I both, when we started the company, I told Brad, I said, I never want to be in that position. When I'm majority owner of the company, when you and I are joint owners of the company, we never want to be in a position where something financial drives a negative decision for people. And so that's why when we started the company, we started it with no debt and no external capital. And we bootstrapped it for 7 years before we took on any financial partner. And even when we took on the financial partner, we were profitable and totally self-funded. And we only sold 19% of the business in that first transaction. And that was a combination of things, why we did that. But so that was one of the learnings from the previous company. We loved what later became software as a service, but we loved the idea of hosting applications for our customers. We didn't really know how to leverage it via the internet, because there were really no internet applications back then. This is in 99 and 2000. And so we were kind of early on the deal. So we developed this database schema, and we built all the screens in Excel, which you've seen some of those old pictures.
Yeah.
And we basically just kind of defined where the data was going to flow and how the user was going to use the system. And we picked 4 industries. We picked automotive, insurance, mortgage, and healthcare. And we thought, man, and then automotive, right? And then so we said we'd like to build kind of a base level application that then we could spin up into other vertical markets, right? And so we called the core technology FireSocket, as you'll remember, and our first real product was DealerSocket, and then our second product was InsureSocket, and our third one was MortgageSocket. That we never launched MortgageSocket because DealerSocket was growing so fast, and InsureSocket we grew for 5 or 6 years, and it was run by Greg Reynolds, who later became our CTO, and we sold that to a company out of Florida in 2007. So it was kind of a modified version of our overall vision. Our overall vision was to really create all these different vertical marketplaces. And now the fun thing is I get to do that same thing now. So now I'm an investor in a company called Filevine, which is basically like DealerSocket, but for law offices. I'm in a company called Model Match. It's basically like DealerSocket, but for mortgage companies and mortgage agencies. On the HR and recruiting side, NeoGov, I'm in a company called NeoGov, that's HR and recruiting software for government agencies. And so we have these great, it's kind of the same model. But when we first started DealerSocket, we thought, we really need to get the product around a vertical market that could have kind of the superset of features and functionality. And when we started to get into automotive, we loved it because number one, we love cars and I love cars. Number two is we love the entrepreneurial zeal of dealers. They just do great things for their community. They're kind of a rough and tumble bunch that many people don't give them a lot of credit for being as professional as they are and as hardworking as they are and as charitable as they are. And as we got in and got to know them really well, it was really cool to have those types of relationships with those people. They were also very late adopters of technology, and they didn't really know how to use technology to better their business. And many of them really made a lot of money through just sweat, just grinding it out, guerrilla warfare at the dealership, and didn't have an MBA, didn't have high degree of schooling, weren't reading a lot of business books, but just were figuring it out and were great relationship people. And so we could employ some best practices through the software that will enable them to kind of adopt things that would help them drive more value into their business. And so I remember you've heard the story, but I remember one of the first times we had the product pretty much designed, not totally built yet, but pretty much designed. I took it into a guy that owned a couple stores here in Southern California. And I said, hey, look what we've created. Isn't this great? Aren't we cool? Won't use our software. And he looked at me and he said, you're not a car guy. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm not a car guy. And he said, well, you see that guy over there holding up the side of the building, smoking a cigarette? He's holding up the side of the building with his shoulder, right? He was leaning against the building smoking. He said, that's my car guy. And that's the guy that sells me 10 to 12 cars a month and makes me a lot of money. That guy will never use what you just showed me. Mm. And I said, oh man. And so then based on that and some other things that happened, Brad and I went and we worked inside of dealerships for about a year. We worked for free so they wouldn't fire us because we asked way too many questions. And we came out the other side of it, launching Dealer Socket into the market in July of 2002. And then I think we hired you shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
What was that?
I was employee number 12.
Number 12. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that? 2004?
2004. Yep.
2004, yeah.
Yep.
So we were profitable at the end of that year. We launched the first dealership in July. Our next dealership didn't come on until October. And that was the longest couple months of my life and my family's life and Brad's family's life.
It's so good to hear some of this stuff, right? The first time you take it, you're excited. You've spent all this time, and you and Brad were probably just, just inside of both of your brains and just in your heads. And you're like, this is great. And then you take it out and people are like, shut you down. And then you have months before anything happens. I don't think people understand how hard that time can be. And just the thoughts and the self-doubt and the fears and how you have to keep pushing through. A lot of times people just see the success at the end. So it's so good to hear about those things that you've gone through.
Yeah, it was a 20-year overnight success.
Yeah.
But in reality, I mean, I deal with this with my kids all the time. For some reason, our culture is now turned into this perfection culture. Mm. You can get on social media, you can get on, anything on the internet and find within 2 clicks, the perfect house, the perfect garage, the perfect workout, the perfect beach body, the perfect whatever. Yeah. And so, when I was in high school, I tell my kids all the time, when I was in high school, like I thought I was the best athlete in the high school or could be, right? I didn't have like the internet to go out and look and say, oh, there's some kid in Georgia that can 360 tomahawk dunk as a 12-year-old, right? Yeah. And so I thought, I was just looking at my peers and saying, yeah, I can measure up against these guys and I can play football. I can play basketball, whatever. Now they're like defeated before they even start. And because of all this external perfectness, the allure of perfectness, right? I kind of look at kind of like Vegas, right? It's so fake, but the facade looks pretty cool.
So dangerous.
Yeah. And you've talked about some of that stuff on your other unpacking podcast, but that's the challenge. And I like that you bring that up because there was a ton of failure in building Dealer Socket, and the failure defined, the failure of the previous company defined what we did and how we did it. The failure as we went forward and as we iterated on the product defined our success. And so I love failure. I
Yeah.
love it. I just love it. It's what creates extreme value if you can get through it.
What you talked about with, when you were playing football and you thought you were the best. I was just reading in Grit, written by Angela Duckworth, amazing book, but she
Great.
talks about how people sometimes don't want to know about the struggles and how you overcame those things because they want to believe that you were just naturally gifted,
Yeah.
because then I don't have to compete with you. You had something that is unachievable for me, so it's easier for me to just think of you as gifted and talented, um, versus it being a level playing field, because that's too much pressure that it puts on ourselves. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's a true principle. I totally agree.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll let you finish the story, but one of the things that already that I've heard you say multiple times, you talked about the dealers, and it was, you kind of talked to them as humans, not customers, but you talked about how they're charitable. Um, you always used to say that when you and Brad sat down and said, what kind of company do we want to create? You always said relationships are the most important thing. And a lot of times when you're starting up your company, you're trying to figure out how are we going to make revenue, what's this, how are we going to get investment, all that. You're not worried about the people and the soft and kind of the fuzzy things, right? But you've always made that a priority, both of you. um where did that come from? Why was that so important for you guys from the very beginning?
Well, I mean, I was benefited a lot growing up of having great people that I could look to as mentors and friends, and people that would walk by me and give me a big, shoulder, being the high school football player. There was a guy in our church group down in San Diego who played for the Chargers, and he would just smile at me and give me this just hard shoulder pop every time he'd walk by me. But he'd smile at me, and he would, then we'd have these conversations, and I was just really enamored with people that when I went away from them, I felt better about myself.
Mm,
And I was like, man, that's a quality that's so impactful to everybody around them. And a lot of times those people don't really know how much effect that really has on, or had on me. And so I've had a little kind of soft spot in my heart for that kind of charity that was enacted on me early in my life. And I thought, man, I'd like to be that kind of person. And I'm still working towards trying to be that kind of a person. And the opposite is also seared in my countenance, right? There were people in my growing up where I thought, man, that one interaction just destroyed that kid. I had some coaches in high school that were, motivation through humiliation, and you know, a bunch of, um, my dad used to say, one or a 10 attaboys can't compensate for one aw shit.
mm.
And, and
I
so I,
love that.
I used to
So
love
true.
that comment. But there was so many guys that would just berate, and especially in the high school coaching ranks, that would just berate individuals, and just, they thought that they just had to beat people down to build them up. And it's kind of the old military adage of, you got to beat them down before you build them back up, but then nobody gets around to building people back up. And so
Mm.
I hate that. I hate it. I don't like going to theme parks. I like going to airports, because I see, like, I don't know what it is about me. I've got my little weird this way, but I see relationships going on all around me. And I see things that are happening where I'm like, oh no, that person's being affected in a really negative way. And
Mm.
it doesn't need to be that way. There's no purpose for it. And so Stacy laughs at me. My wife laughs at me, because she'll see me and I'll just be watching, and she'll be like, Jonathan, just relax. I'll be like, gosh, I can't handle this. But it goes back to this point of charity, which I've learned over time, and I've put some words around it. And in our culture, in our world, we look at charity as giving something to somebody that doesn't have anything, right? Whether it's money, or whether it's food, or whether it's whatever. The challenge is the way that kind of religious and philosophic history goes. That's not really charity. Charity is the essence of building someone up to see themselves for what they can become.
Mm.
and not just giving them something that they either become addicted to or dependent on, or right. It's really the offering of, hey, teach a guy to fish versus giving them a fish. And so this charitable attribute, it was so important to Brad and I when we started the business, because it's the way we interacted with each other. And we wanted to have those same types of relationships with our employees, because we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, you knew us when when we were early, right? And so we didn't want to act like we knew everything. We kind of faked it until we made it. But even toward the end, we were just like, hey, we're figuring it out. But we always thought that the relationship side of it and the charitable side of it was something so much more important than profits, or than dollars, or than even, whatever adulations or customer success we could possibly get, because the relationships are what endure. This life is all about relationships.
That's I Yeah, I mean, it takes me back to Dealer Socket, because what you were saying, you absolutely did for me. You did for so many people, right? I think that's the legacy beyond the payouts and all that stuff, like you said. Um, the way you guys thought about it was such a long-term play, which I think is really hard for people. I mean, we think about how we approach anything in life, and it's so short term, right? Grades, this, that, right? Trophies, all of that. It's just such a short term play, and it's so easy to fall into that trap. So I've heard lots of leaders, do the lip service around relationships and employees first. But why do you think they're not able to fully embrace it the way you guys did? How were you guys able to stay strong and not get sucked into what was all around you, and that the profits and the numbers and all of that? That's not easy to do.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of a combination of Brad and I, right? We both had some cultural upbringing and some good parenting, that enabled us to see people a little differently than
Yeah.
just as a use case for some benefit that can be derived by me, and then shed them, right? Which is a lot of what businesses do. But the other side of it is, I think there's an eternal perspective that's really important to understand. And that's hard for business people to think about, right? They're thinking about the next day, the next quarter, the next month, the next sale. But when you think about it from an eternal perspective, right? You and I have talked about this a little bit just offline, but is that there are eternal relationships at play here. And C.S. Lewis, who is a great writer, right? He wrote the books, the Narnia books, and then wrote a bunch of great papers on a bunch of stuff. He said an interesting statement, and I'm gonna just screw it all up. But he basically said, if you could see the people that you're walking around and interfacing with in their true light, you
Mm.
would see that you're walking around with deity, with gods and goddesses, and right, and just people that are in embryo, and we're here in this earth life going through this motion to learn stuff, and we all have our different things that we need to learn and grow with in this life. But I believe that from an eternal perspective, we're all kind of on different paths, and some of the people that are serving us are probably significantly further advanced than us in the next life. And I think the beautiful thing about your religious beliefs is that's very consistent with that, right? With kind of reincarnation and moksha and the whole, and we talked about it before. And so my belief structure is very grounded in that there are relationships that are eternal, and that those relationships are really, really, really important, and that the tangential effect of our interactions with each other, is our stewardship. It is a stewardship of mine to make sure that I don't screw somebody up and get someone on a different variant or a different deviated plane that then shoots them in a direction that is negative, and will continue to divert off of course for an extended period of time. That's unacceptable for me to do that. And so, and I do it, right? Because I'm human and I make mistakes, and we all make those mistakes. But if we're conscious about trying not to do it, I think you can minimize those interactions that are so negative for people. and you kind of have to get outside yourself a little bit. You got to be a little bit less selfish. You got to constantly tell yourself to stop being selfish, because this world will tell us, hey, be selfish, be selfish, be selfish. And so you kind of have to kind of back yourself off that ledge, which at times in my life I've been good at, and at times in my life I have not been good at that. But it's the knowledge of it, of making sure that you understand that this is a stewardship, and we have a stewardship over each other. These relationships that we have, it's not just a simple interaction. There's some level of stewardship with every interaction that we have every single day, that either propels someone forward in a positive direction or depletes them a little bit. And I hope and pray that I can not do more good than bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
And I remember at Dealer Socket from the very beginning, you would say, see people for their potential and who they truly are, not how they're behaving in the moment. And a lot of times I would be like, what? What does that mean? And it took me so many, I mean, you kept saying it, right? Almost every company call or talk or whatever it was, you would say that every single time. And it took me years to really understand what that meant. And just it's so powerful, planting seeds, even though someone's not ready to understand it fully. It's still planting those seeds, and then one day you have this big aha moment where it all comes to you. And that's what I loved, is you were never trying to force that on people. It was just this, you lived that way, you led that way. Um, and I think for a lot of people, it's hard for them to take that route, because the route you took, and it wasn't a strategic route, that's just your beliefs and your values, still led to the profits and the productivity and the phenomenal performance by people, but it came from a different place than bonuses or fear or because you have to do it or deadlines. And that is so powerful that it feels like a lot of leaders and businesses um, just don't want to spend the time and energy to truly understand that philosophy and take that approach, because it's more powerful than the other approach.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that pained us early on was that we had a lot of friends, right, and family members that worked inside the company, and from kind of close knit communities, right, that we all grew up in. And one thing that I learned early on is when Brad and I first got to be partners, I said, Brad, I will never go home and say anything negative about you to my wife. And he said the same thing to me, because, I remember my dad telling me one time that when he first got his first job out of college, he worked for Humble Oil and Refining Company, and he would come home and he'd tell my mom, he'd be, oh, this guy, he's so overbearing, and he's, totally incapable of doing what he's doing. And he'd have all these statements. And then my mom went with him to the Christmas party that year, and my mom was just a total pain in the butt to my dad at the Christmas party. And my dad walked out after the Christmas party and said, Margaret, to my mom, why are you treating these people this way? Like, I don't understand it. And my mom looked at him and goes, I can't believe you can even be civil to those people after what you've told me about them.
I love that story.
And so we tend to, right? We tend to, in these environments, talk about the negative. When we leave work, right, the things that are on the top of our mind are the negative things. And then we go home and tell our family members and the people around us kind of the negative things that happen. And I don't know why that was a big kind of one of the key pillars of when Brad and I first started the company. It was, everyone outside of the doors, we're going to be trying to be extremely honest with people in the room. And then when we leave the room, we're not going to say bad things about each other.
Yep.
And we're going to, if there's something that needs to be solved, it's going to be the problem that needs to be solved, not the person that needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
And people they progress in that environment really, really well. And so I think that was part of it too, is we had it, and some of this is really selfish, right? We wanted to have an environment where we wanted to be totally excited to come to work every day. And I wanted to walk in the door and see Neha's smiling face. I didn't want you to feel like, oh, Jonathan's going to come, say something to me about why the system went down last night. right? I don't want that. You don't want that. You already know the stuff that you're working on and you're trying to figure out. You're conscientious. You understand what the deal is. And so I don't know if many people understood this, but I was always focused in those meetings on scaling successes, right? What are the successes that we can repeat and keep going and doing versus let's analyze all the faults. And
Yeah.
sometimes that frustrates people, right? Because it's a different type of meeting. And there were many times when we'd walk out of meetings and there were certain people that liked kind of going through and ad nauseum going over the negatives and trying to figure out the negatives. And I just don't think that way. And there's a little bit of a deficiency there, I think, because sometimes you do have to go that route. But I just love scaling the positives, right? Trying to figure out what are the positive things we can keep doing, and how can we weed out the negative by doing more of the positive, right? And I tell that with my kids too now. It's like, I don't like to, in our culture, we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't have sex before we're married, that kind of stuff. And part of it is like, what are the good things we're doing, right? It's not just a checklist religion of, but it's, we want to act and not be acted upon. So we don't want to be acted upon by debt or by drugs or by alcohol or by those things. We want to be free and have liberty and choice going forward. And so what are the things that we're doing with our freedom? Let's go out and do something. Let's go work out. Let's go, throw the football. Let's go, ride motorcycle. Let's go do something that's fun and that can weed out the negative.
Yeah.
And all too often in business and in life, we have this check boxes of here's all the things I'm not going to do because some book told me not to do it. But what are the things we should be doing, right? That keep us away from, just naturally keep us away from the stuff that is dangerous to us. So I don't know.
It's so funny. I mean, everything you're saying, it's all about you've worked on yourself and your values, and that has helped you in every aspect of life. And I, the more after I had kids, I've thought about what is the most important thing I want to teach my kids, and it's all about everything that's inside of you. That's because you figured that out and everything else falls into place. And about the mistakes, I remember a friend of mine got this incredible job with a great company here locally, and it's her dream job, and she's high up there. And she was talking about how there was a big mistake that someone made, and so they were working late, and the president of the company called her and was like, all right, what do we need to do? Right. And I had to stop, and I was thinking about the 15 years I was at Dealer Socket. And I told her, I was like, not once did anyone do that. And it's not because I didn't make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes, big mistakes. I remember one time we had a company call and we were setting up the phone system and all that so that we could have 1,000 people on the call. We hadn't done too many of those. And something went wrong, and it was it was on my shoulders. And I remember I was frustrated, and I remember walking by your office, and I was like, hey, I'm so sorry. And he's like, no worries. You were like, no, it's all good. I know you're doing great things and you'll figure it. I mean, that was it. And it made me feel like I wanted to do even better. Again, it was such a soft approach, whereas I think sometimes people just jump on that impulse they have of I've got to do something and I've got to make sure that the other person knows they screwed up. And it's really, you're just serving yourself. You're not really helping the other person. But I always remember that story, and I was like, not once in 15 years um, did my leadership team ever make me feel that way, because they just knew it was more impactful to just continue to lift me up and let me kind of rise to that. I love that
Yeah,
story.
that's cool. I remember that call actually.
You do.
Yeah, that's awesome though. I've found that fear is a horrible long-term motivator.
Mm,
It just, I mean, in certain instances, right, with sports or with doing something physically that you just have to go out and do for a short amount of time, fear can be a great motivator, right? Running away from danger, right? Fighting, doing something that's just kind of forced upon you. But long term, fear is not sustainable as a motivator. And the only thing that is sustainable as a motivator is enablement, right? How do we enable people to achieve the potential that we know they can achieve? Or that, and how do we see more in someone than they see in themselves? Because then you become a true friend.
Yeah.
right? And you used the statement earlier that, we don't treat people for how they're acting at a given moment. We have to kind of see past it and say, hey, what do I think? Is Jonathan capable? What's Jonathan capable of? And how can I give him the tools and the ability and counsel him up enough to get him to achieve some of that potential and become what he's destined to become? And I've had many people in my life do that for me. And now the funnest thing about what I do now is, because I'm on, as you know, I'm on a bunch of boards and invest in small technology companies that are growing fairly quickly, as I get to have these conversations with CEOs now. And it's awesome to have these conversations and be so positive. And there's nothing you get overly concerned about, right? There's just kind of opportunities to tackle.
Yeah.
But you get people the skill sets, and they can just charge forward, and you enable people, and it makes all the difference in the world. But if you put fear into them, then they're always going to be second guessing the conversations they have with you. And they're also going to stop communicating with you, right? They're going to stop giving you the whole truth, because they're going to try to mask as much of the problem as they can, thinking that they can solve it before anybody finds out about it.
Yeah.
And that's not healthy for anybody. And so, yeah.
How, so you've been, you're on various boards, you've met with lots of companies, you've been at the table with some, you know, very well-known leaders, all that kind of stuff. I believe there's a consciousness of, within a family, within an individual, a family, a city, a country, the world, right? There's this feeling of where we're at, as humanity, I guess, from a human perspective. What are you seeing out there in the business world? Do you feel like people are understanding this philosophical approach to business versus just the numbers and cutthroat and, this is what you do and here's the white papers and don't ask questions? Or do you feel like there's a shift that's happening?
I think entrepreneurial companies, for the most part, still maintain a little bit of that. You do see some dictatorial entrepreneurial companies, right, where you just have kind of a dictator. I'm thinking of one off the top of my head, but I'm not going to say the name. But that just kind of drive success based on the way they want it to happen, and then they kind of fire anyone that speaks against them, right? And so there is some of that, but most of the time entrepreneurs are people that love their customers, that are trying to create a solution for something and aren't just solely money hungry. I think one of the challenges that we've impacted here, especially in the last 30 years, is this whole idea of so much money sitting on the sidelines and private equity playing such a big game in business and buying up entrepreneurial businesses. It's been great for entrepreneurs, and they cash out and they made a lot of money doing it. But the companies themselves and the individuals that work for those companies, most often don't have a better experience once a private equity company takes over than they had when the entrepreneur was there.
Yep.
And so what does that mean? That means that when you get disconnected from people and from customers and from solutions, then, and you only look at numbers and white papers and kind of the best practices of business as espoused by talking heads, it goes bad. And you'll find people to do the job, and you'll find managers, right? But I think you lose a lot of the creative talent and the leadership talent and the camaraderie and the culture that really creates wonderful companies, right? And you can see that. I mean, some of the best companies, like Southwest Airlines for a long time was such a great company because of their leader, right? I mean, they had just a different mindset on things, and they were able to maintain that and kind of distance themselves from the status quo or the norm. JetBlue was kind of the same way. I mean, I'm thinking about airlines now, but
Sure.
But there are some companies that do it well at scale. But it's hard. It's hard when you get a lot of talking heads sitting around the table that are investment bankers and finance guys that have worked. I look at my son-in-law, Jacob Bryson. He's a phenomenal guy. He works for Catalyst, an investment bank, and he works 120 hours a week, 150 hours a week. he's working his darn full head off, and he's doing it. He's learning a lot, but he's learning a lot about numbers and not as much about kind of what happens, when something goes wrong and the pressure's on and the plane's going down, and how do you make those decisions in the cockpit, right? And so you take a person like that out of that environment of working so many hours inside of Excel till the wee hours of the morning, putting together financial models, and then you take them out of that model, and their natural course of progression is to go work in private equity. And so what do? They hammer the numbers, all they know, and then they try to be operationally savvy, but it kind of falls on its face. And so I think there's a challenge, and some of these companies are getting it right. I work with Warburg Pincus now, and about 10% of my time I'm an executive in residence with them, and they've done a really good job of hiring and bringing in people like me that have had experience as operators and in the pilot seat, and then they kind of wrap around that all the metrics and enablement stuff that they know from a investment banking and private equity and finance side. And so it works better that way. But I think we need to do better as an overall industry of just really understanding culture, not for culture's sake, which you and I have both been through a couple of those exercises, right? The pyramid or whatever.
Yeah.
But really for like what drives us and what makes us happy. And it's not usually something that can be written down inside of a pyramid and put you in a 9-box quadrant and say, you're a high achiever but low performer, or you're a high potential low performer, right? I mean, it just doesn't equate. Each person's a little bit different, and you gotta have that love and be able to see that person for their next logical step of progression.
Yeah.
Right. And if we can see people for the next logical step of progression, then we're going to help them get there. And they're going to start seeing us the same way. And they're going to be like, hey, Jonathan could really be valued from this. And so we can just help each other. Right. And it's just a different mindset.
Yeah. I'm even with my company Hatch Brighter, we've found that when people can't measure something and they can't quantify it, they just hide from it. They shy away from it. And I
Yeah.
remember even throughout my career, working with people from top consulting companies, right? The McKinsey's, Bain's, whatever, all those, they would come in, and it was very clear that it was a people or leadership problem, but they couldn't see that. It was all about the process, and here's the white paper, and here's the best practices. And you try and shove that stuff down, the business's throat, I guess, without addressing the culture and people, like you said, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I love that.
I used to go into our office, and like I would get excited when we sell a big deal or we close a big customer, or we'd have month over month record sales. I mean, all that stuff's cool and great. But the thing that lit me up the most is like walking through the office and just feeling the energy from people and seeing someone else smile as they're going through some little challenge. And I used to love to walk by our accounting department, because my office in the
Yep.
dealer socket building here in San Clemente was, and I'd walk right through the accounting department, and those girls had a tough job. I mean, they were like on the collection phone, and they were on the phones. They were billing out a bunch of things. We were going through the BOSS implementation, implementing a new accounting system, all that stuff. And they were just, I mean, it was hard. And they weren't well suited for that. I mean, they'd never gone through it before. I mean, the Catherine Rouse of the world are just sweet, wonderful people, but they'd never gone through a systems implementation like that before. And I used to love walking by there and just having them pick their heads up out of the cubes and say, "Hey, Jonathan." And I knew that they were just underwater in something. And I'd be like, "Oh, how are you? How's your family?" I'd throw a piece of candy at them. They'd throw something at me.
Yeah.
And that's what lights me up, right? And I mean, sometimes that frustrated people when I'd walk into meetings and I just constantly want to just have a joke fest, right? And just talk. And everybody be like, "Hey, let's get to the point. I got things to do." I'm like, "No, let's just relax a little bit, We're here to have fun."
That was the best. So, I think you and I have been able to experience it firsthand. And I think what's amazing about what you've done, and part of the dealer socket legacy, is not the money or any of that, but just that, the environment that you and Brad created has now, for me, when I wanted to start my own thing, that was one of the number one things I wanted to do, is I want to create a company that has that kind of environment and leads with that philosophy. Um, so, but sometimes if you're not around that or you haven't experienced it, it's hard to really understand it or learn it. So what would your advice be to someone who maybe hasn't had that type of leadership or worked at a company like that but wants to lead that way or wants to understand it? How does someone learn that?
I mean, the simple statement is nothing in this life is more important than our souls, meaning that our, the essence of who we are. And so when you walk into a business and you are more interested in the profits or the product or the dollar or whatever than you are in the person, it's going to fail long term, right? And so if we're conscientious about the person, and that doesn't mean you can't fire people. That doesn't mean you can't have honest conversations with people, but it has to come from a place of, hey, you know what? I'm here to try to help you to be better. And I know you're here to help me try to be better. And so if you're not working out in this environment because you're not progressing, then I want to help you find another environment where you can progress in. And that may be somewhere else, and that's fine. And you can move people around and you can get new people in roles. And I mean, Darren Harris is a great example of exactly that, right? There's a bunch of different things that happened in his work life career at Dealer Socket that were positive and negative, depending on how you looked at it. And there was a lot of tough conversations that I had with Darren and that he had with me over moving him around from role to role and from position to position. And at the end of the day, I think he'd tell you that, man, he learned more because of the changes that we put him through outside of some of the stuff that was enacted by the private equity company. We'll put that aside. But the other stuff that we went through, that he learned more about going from consulting to sales, back to accounting, right, to operations. And even though there was different pay structures and different, just short-term uncomfortableness, Jay Trotter's another one, right? Got really uncomfortable with him, anybody moving his cheese, and he'd tell you that. But he grew and became better because we moved his cheese, and he was humble enough to say, "Hey, I trust you."
Yep.
And so I think that you have to have that kind of environment to really enable the kind of growth that's possible. And then if you do that and you're constantly looking out for what's the next logical progressionary step for this person or this team, then you can have really honest conversations with people. And most of the time they'll look at it rationally and say, I kind of understand. Sometimes they won't, but at least you can be calm and peaceful from a conscience perspective, that you are looking at it the right way from the individual's perspective, right?
Love
And
that.
I've had many people come. It's interesting. Sometimes you feel like you've damaged someone, and then they'll come back years later and they'll be like, "Hey, I'm sorry. I didn't realize kind of what was going on. I've since leaving, I've learned X, Y, and Z,
Mm.
and I want to come back. Or I've learned X, Y, and Z, and thank you for pushing me out of my comfort zone." And sometimes I've had huge anxiety around certain individuals for years, and then they'll finally come back around and we'll have a great conversation, and we'll understand each other. And so it's not to say that you're not going to have those challenges, but if you feel like you're a steward over someone's progression or someone's, essence or soul, then I think you manage a little bit differently.
I love that. 100% agree. I could talk to you for hours, Jonathan. So much wisdom, and I just think this needs to be more of the common way of leading and running businesses. And I know you're doing great stuff on these boards, but hopefully someday there will be a book or some other format where you can reach more people, because it's absolutely phenomenal. It's something you did with such ease and without following a book or best practices. But there's no doubt in my mind that this is the way that everyone needs to lead and run businesses, and it would just make the world a better place. And yeah, it's a win-win for everyone.
Well, I'm a huge fan of yours. I've been a huge fan of yours for a long time. And so I still am a little bummed out that I don't get invited to all the Patel family parties, but Uh, maybe someday.
Well,
But
no one's getting invited right now with
that's true. That's true.
COVID, but
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Wait, yeah. Way to make me look like I'm not doing my part for the community. No, I'm a huge fan of yours. And so I love what you're doing. I think it's awesome. And I think you're taking a lot of these principles that you innately have as well and are trying to get them in the minds of great parents that can help change the future. And so I'm a total resource for you, and I appreciate you being a resource for me and my family as well.
awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Okay, we
All
love the
right.
Patels.
Okay, I stopped the recording, but how'd that feel? That
That
was
was
fun.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah, I love talking to you.
Yeah.
Good.